one from a bankrupt dictator trying to hijack a fifth of the world's oil, to a secret black jet that looked like a flying Dorito, to a 400-mile left hook through an impassable desert that crushed a million-man army in just 4 days. This is Operation Desert Storm Explained, and by the end of this video, you'll understand how America rewrote the rules of warfare overnight and buried the ghost of Vietnam in the desert sand. But our story begins on a scorching night in August 1990 in the Palace of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein had a massive problem. He'd just spent 8 brutal years fighting a meat grinder war against Iran, and Iraq was broke. We're talking $80 billion in debt, with an economy running on fumes. But Saddam looked across his southern border and saw an easy jackpot: Kuwait. Tiny, defenseless, and practically floating on oil. So at 2 a.m. on August 2nd, Saddam rolled over 100,000 troops and 700 tanks across the Kuwaiti border. The invasion wasn't a battle, it was a mugging. Within 14 hours, Kuwait's government had fled, and Saddam suddenly controlled 20% of the world's entire oil supply. And if he decided to keep driving south into Saudi Arabia, he'd hold the global economy by the throat. Now, why on earth did Saddam think he could just steal an entire country and get away with it? Because just like Hitler in 1939, Saddam was a gambler. And when he looked across the Atlantic at the United States, he didn't see a superpower. He saw a country that was still deeply traumatized by the Vietnam War. For 15 years, American politicians, generals, and voters had been haunted by what historians call the Vietnam Syndrome, a paralyzing fear of getting dragged into another foreign swamp, losing thousands of young men, and watching the country tear itself apart on the evening news. In fact, just days before the invasion, Saddam sat in a room with the U.S. ambassador and literally said it to her face: "Yours is a society which cannot accept 10,000 dead in one battle." He bet everything on one simple conviction: America was soft, and Washington would blink. Big mistake, buddy. But here's the crazy part. Even when President George H.W. Bush drew a line in the sand and ordered American troops to defend Saudi Arabia, almost everyone on TV thought Saddam was right. Western journalists, Soviet military advisors, and politicians in Washington were panicking. Why? Because in 1990, Iraq wasn't some pushover militia. They boasted the 4th largest army on the planet, 1 million battle-hardened soldiers, over 5,000 Soviet-built main battle tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, chemical weapons, and the elite Republican Guard, Saddam's fiercely loyal shock troops. On top of that, the Iraqis had spent months digging into southern Kuwait, building a terrifying defensive belt known as the Saddam Line. We're talking miles of razor wire, concrete bunkers, millions of landmines, and fire trenches filled with crude oil ready to be ignited the second an American boot touched the sand. Almost every expert predicted a slaughter. News anchors were bracing the public for 20,000, maybe 30,000 American body bags. A second Vietnam in the desert. But what Saddam, and frankly most of the media, didn't realize was that while America had been quietly licking its wounds after Vietnam, the Pentagon hadn't been sleeping. Out in the deserts of Nevada and the secret design labs of California, a new generation of American commanders and engineers had spent the last decade building a war machine from the future. Men like General Norman Schwarzkopf, a barrel-chested Vietnam veteran who'd been wounded in the jungle and swore to God that if America ever went to war again, they'd never fight with half measures or one hand tied behind their back. Saddam promised the world the mother of all battles. He had no idea he was about to walk into the mother of all ambushes. January 17th, 1991. 2:38 a.m. Baghdad was fast asleep, but its skies were guarded by the most heavily defended airspace anywhere on Earth, outside of Moscow. Saddam had spent billions building a French-designed air defense network called KARI. We're talking 16,000 surface-to-air missiles, 10,000 anti-aircraft guns, and an interconnected web of early warning radars that could spot an approaching enemy from hundreds of miles away. Any conventional Air Force trying to fly straight into that buzzsaw would have been shredded to pieces. So America didn't fly straight into it. They kicked the front door off its hinges in the dark. Before the main attack even started, a secret strike team of 8 Army AH-64 Apache helicopters, led by Air Force Pavlo helicopters acting as pathfinders, screamed across the desert floor at just 30 feet above the sand. Flying in pitch-black darkness with night vision goggles, their rotors kicking up rooster tails of dust. They hunted down Iraq's two most critical border radar stations. At exactly 2:38 a.m., the Apaches unleashed a swarm of Hellfire missiles, obliterating the radar dishes in seconds. They had literally just shot out Iraq's eyes. And through that blind spot in the radar fence, the ghosts slid in. Enter the F-117 Nighthawk. Built by Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, it didn't even look like an airplane. It was an angular, matte black wedge of pure science fiction that pilots nicknamed the Flying Dorito. But to an enemy radar screen, a 45-foot-long bomber looked about the size of a single bumblebee. As those Nighthawks slipped silently over Baghdad, the pilots were sweating bullets. They were flying solo, with no radio chatter, no headlights, and no fighter escort, straight into the heart of an armed capital. And then, the bomb bay doors snapped open, the only moment the aircraft was ever briefly visible to radar, and dropped 2,000-pound laser-guided bunker busters right down the ventilation shafts of Saddam's command centers. 3. Suddenly, air raid sirens wailed across Baghdad. Anti-aircraft guns erupted all at once, firing thousands of glowing tracer rounds into the night sky until the city lit up brighter than Times Square on New Year's Eve. But here was the crazy part. The Iraqis were firing at nothing. They were shooting blindly into empty air because their radar screens were completely blank. And for the first time in human history, the entire planet was watching it happen live. From a ninth-floor room in the Al Rashid Hotel, CNN reporters Bernard Shaw, John Holloman, and Peter Arnett were hiding under tables, holding a microphone to a satellite phone as bombs shook the building. Millions of Americans and Saddam himself sat glued to their TVs in absolute shock as precision-guided weapons surgically dismantled a modern capital in real time. One bomb took out the central communications tower. Another sliced through the power grid. Within minutes, Saddam's generals couldn't even call their own frontline commanders. And that opening night was just the appetizer. For the next 38 straight days and nights, coalition aircraft flew over 100,000 sorties. They pounded airfields, blew up bridges with Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from warships miles out at sea, and unleashed A-10 Warthogs to hunt Iraqi tanks in the desert like fish in a barrel. By mid-February, the fourth largest army in the world was starving, deaf, and blind. But Saddam still had one card left to play. He looked at his 500,000 dug-in troops along the Kuwaiti coast and smiled. Because air power is great, but to actually take land back, you still have to send infantry through the mud, the mines, and the blood. Saddam braced his entire army along the beaches and the southern border, waiting for the American Marines to launch a massive D-Day-style amphibious invasion straight into his teeth. But General Norman Schwarzkopf had zero intention of playing Saddam's game. In fact, while the Iraqis were staring at the ocean, Schwarzkopf was quietly setting up the greatest military deception since World War II. By late February 1991, Saddam Hussein was convinced he knew exactly how this war was going to play out. He looked at the map of Kuwait and saw two logical attack routes: straight north across the Saudi border, or an amphibious assault from the Persian Gulf. And frankly, the Americans were doing everything they could to prove him right. Out in the Gulf, a massive armada of U.S. Navy warships steamed back and forth just off the Kuwaiti coastline. On TV, CNN broadcasted dramatic footage of thousands of U.S. Marines practicing amphibious beach landings in broad daylight. General Norman Schwarzkopf even went out of his way to make sure news crews filmed hospital ships docking near the coast. He was playing the media and Iraqi intelligence like a cheap fiddle. Saddam swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. He rushed his best infantry divisions, his heaviest artillery, and his elite Republican Guard straight to the southern border and the Kuwaiti beaches, bracing for a bloody, head-on collision. But while Saddam was staring at the front door, Schwarzkopf was sneaking 250,000 soldiers around the back. To the west of Kuwait lay hundreds of miles of desolate, featureless gravel and shifting sand, the Saudi-Iraqi desert. Iraqi generals didn't bother putting heavy defenses out there for one simple reason. They considered it completely impassable. No roads, no water, no landmarks. Any modern army that tried to drive thousands of heavy tanks through that empty wasteland would get hopelessly lost and run out of fuel in days. Well, Schwarzkopf looked at that impassable desert and saw a 400-mile highway straight to Saddam's blind side. What followed was one of the most insane logistical miracles in military history. Under the cover of total radio silence, and hidden from Iraqi scouts by a solid wall of American combat patrols, Schwarzkopf moved 250,000 soldiers, 60,000 vehicles, and thousands of tanks 250 miles to the west. Imagine taking the entire population of Orlando, Florida, along with all their cars, food, ammunition, and gas, and secretly moving them across the desert in the dark without anyone noticing. The French call this maneuver a catenary. In boxing, it's a left hook. Schwarzkopf's men just called it the Hail Mary, but there was still one massive problem. How do you navigate an army of 250,000 men through a featureless sea of sand without driving in circles? Remember, this is 1991. The Pentagon had just started putting a revolutionary new space technology into orbit called the Global Positioning System, GPS. But the system wasn't even finished yet, and the military didn't have enough military-grade receivers to go around. So what did Americans do? They improvised. 4 soldiers' families back home literally drove to local boating shops and Radio Shack stores across America, bought up commercial Magellan GPS units off the shelves, and mailed them to the desert. You had 60-ton M1 Abrams tanks and armored Humvees rolling into battle with civilian GPS receivers duct-taped to their dashboards. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. By February 23rd, the trap was set. Saddam's army was dug into the coast, staring out at the ocean, waiting for an amphibious invasion that was never going to come. Meanwhile, 250 miles to their west, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers sat in their armored vehicles with the engines idling, staring across the unguarded Iraqi border. Schwarzkopf had just outflanked the 4th largest army on Earth before firing a single shot on the ground. At 4 a.m. on February 24th, 1991, the radio silence finally broke. Schwarzkopf gave the order, and the steel avalanche began to move. What was supposed to be a months-long bloodbath was about to become the most one-sided, terrifyingly fast ground offensive in human history. At dawn on February 24th, 1991, the mother of all ambushes finally sprang shut. Along the southern Kuwaiti border, U.S. Marines and Army infantry smashed straight through the Saddam line, clearing minefields with armored bulldozers and breaching razor wire in a matter of hours, not days. But the real blow landed 150 miles to the west. Out of the empty desert came a terrifying wall of American steel. Hundreds of M1A1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles came roaring across the gravel at 30 miles an hour, driving straight into the rear of Saddam's army. Iraqi commanders were in absolute shock. They were looking at empty ocean, while 250,000 Allied troops kicked their back door off the hinges. By day 3, Saddam realized he was being encircled and ordered his most prized units, the elite Republican Guard, to stand their ground and stop the American onslaught. And on February 26th, nature gave the Iraqis what looked like a miracle. A massive desert sandstorm, known as a shamal, slammed into the desert. Howling winds, freezing rain, and swirling yellow sand dropped visibility down to practically zero. You couldn't see a tank 50 yards in front of your face. The Republican Guard's Tawakalna division dug their Soviet-built T-72 tanks into the sand dunes along a map coordinate known as 73 Easting. They figured the blinding storm would level the playing field. After all, if you can't see the target, you can't hit it, right? Wrong. Enter Captain H.R. McMaster and the men of Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. What the Iraqis didn't understand was that every American M1A1 Abrams tank was equipped with FLIR, forward-looking infrared thermal imaging sights. To an Iraqi gunner staring out his periscope, the desert was a solid wall of yellow dust. But to an American gunner looking through a thermal screen, the hot engine blocks and exhaust pipes of Iraqi tanks glowed through the sandstorm like neon signs on the Las Vegas Strip. What followed at 73 Easting wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Charging through the blinding sand at full speed, Eagle Troop crested a rise and ran headfirst into an entrenched Republican Guard brigade. McMaster fired first, blowing the turret off an Iraqi tank at 1,000 yards. Within 23 minutes, 9 American tanks and 12 Bradleys systematically destroyed nearly 30 Iraqi tanks and 14 armored vehicles. How many American tanks were lost in that charge? 0. Not a single one. Across the entire desert, the story was the exact same. American crews were destroying Iraqi armor from 2 miles away, long before the enemy's guns were even in range to fire back. The 4th largest army on Earth was completely disintegrating. In fact, Iraqi soldiers were so terrified of American firepower that they started surrendering to literally anything that moved. They surrendered to Italian news crews. They surrendered to empty helicopters. On Falika Island, a group of Iraqi soldiers even waved white bedsheets and surrendered to a tiny American reconnaissance drone buzzing 500 feet over their heads. Just pause and think about that. Grown men surrendering to a remote-controlled toy airplane because they knew what was coming next if they didn't. Exactly 100 hours after the ground invasion began, President George H.W. Bush ordered a ceasefire. 100 hours, just over 4 days. The media had warned America to brace for 30,000 body bags and a second Vietnam. But when the smoke cleared, the total number of American combat deaths in the entire ground war was 148. Every single one of those lives lost was a tragedy for a family back home. But militarily, the world had never seen a victory so decisive, so fast, and so overwhelming in the history of warfare. Kuwait was free. Saddam's military was crushed. And as millions of yellow ribbons were tied around trees from coast to coast, America welcomed its veterans home with massive ticker tape parades in New York City and Washington, D.C. President Bush addressed a cheering nation and said the words that defined an era. By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. America proved that a free society doesn't have to fight endless, messy wars in the mud when it trusts its commanders, values its soldiers' lives, and fights to win. Man, I'm the proudest eagle on the planet right now. I freaking love this country.